Hello and welcome to episode 39 of the Factory Reset podcast. This podcast is all about being loyal, obedient subjects of King Jesus. My name is Tommy, and we are, I believe, nearing the end of a series of episodes about marriage. In the last episode, I talked about part of the solution to adulterous remarriage, a marriage in which one or both parties has a living spouse from a previous first marriage. Jesus calls remarriage adultery. In his mind, remarriage is an adulterous affair. It is not allowed in his kingdom any more than cheating on your spouse behind their back is allowed. If someone is remarried while their first spouse is alive, or if they have gotten married to someone who has a living spouse from their first marriage, that is an adulterous relationship that has to come to an end. Or if there are kids involved, then at the very least, the nature of that relationship needs to change dramatically. But now the question is, then what? What about after you have gotten out of a remarriage? Should a person return to their first spouse if possible? And what about the person in a remarriage who had not been previously married? Are they allowed to get out of that adulterous relationship and seek a legitimate marriage? People who have a serious approach to discipleship and obedience to Jesus sometimes come to different conclusions on this. Some would say that you should go back to your first spouse if possible. The second marriage is adultery because the first marriage is still on. You are bound to that first spouse until death, and you should act like it. Leave the person you're committing adultery with and go back to the person God actually joined you to and keep the promise that you made to them. Don't live like a single person. Live like a married person because you are one. And then the person in the now dissolved remarriage, the person who had not been previously married, they are free to enter into a legitimate marriage since they've never been in one before. They've never been joined by God to anyone, but they've only engaged in the equivalent of an adulterous affair. But there are other Christians today who take a different view of this. They would say that the second marriage, though adulterous, is binding. It is a marriage that has consequences. And so the solution is for the remarried couple to divorce and for all parties involved to remain single and celibate as long as they're all alive. To reconcile with your first spouse would be a violation of the second marriage and would be a serious sin that will cost you your eternal life. So let's say John marries a divorced woman, Sarah, whose first husband, Dave, is still alive. And Dave has now gotten remarried to Tina. The solution is that John and Sarah and Dave and Tina, all four of them need to separate and be single and celibate. John is bound to Sarah. Sarah is bound to both John and Dave is bound to both Sarah and Tina, but nobody can be with anyone else while they're all alive. Both of these views are serious views. Both of them are potentially quite costly, depending on the circumstances. At the same time, either one could be more or less appealing to someone, depending on their situation. Some people might want to reconcile with their first spouse. Other people would rather be single than to have to reconcile with someone they don't want to be with. But aside from what view may or may not be more appealing to each individual, we need to try and figure out which one is right, which one is pleasing to the heart of God, which one is most in line with what Jesus taught and modeled for us, which one is the most natural conclusion to come to if we're working out the implications of the texts that speak directly to this issue. Because we're not given explicit instructions on what to do about remarriage in the New Covenant. We're only given some basic teachings and principles, and there are a number of passages that we can draw implications from. Well, I think that the first view, that we should return to our first spouse if possible, is correct. In this episode, I'll lay out my case for this view, that we should go back to our first spouse. It's a very simple case that doesn't require a whole lot of explanation. And then in the next episode, I will respond to some of the most thoughtful arguments I've heard from people who hold the other view, that the remarried are bound to singleness as long as everyone involved is alive. All right, so the reason I hold to the first view, that we should return to our first spouse if possible, is that I think it is the most natural and logical view to come to if we are looking only at what Jesus and Paul have to say about this. It is the view that most naturally flows from the New Testament texts that speak directly to this issue, and I think it is the view that most honors and elevates the teaching of Jesus. I think the second view is strange because it suggests that God joins people together in adultery, and it says that marriages which Jesus calls adulterous are actually just as binding as the marriages Jesus says are joined by God and good in his eyes. And I also think it leads to strange practical conclusions, which I think I'll get to talk about more in the next episode. All right, so here we go. Here's my case. First of all, Mosaic law is not in the picture here. Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 is not in the picture. There are some who say we cannot return to our first spouse after remarriage has occurred because of Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, which I think is sort of elevating the teaching of Moses over the teaching of Jesus and kind of giving Moses the last word on this issue. But there are two problems with this. Number one, Deuteronomy 24 has marriage standards that are irreconcilable with Jesus' expectations and standards for us in the New Covenant. Unlike in the New Covenant, Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 allows remarriage, at least implicitly. It acknowledges that remarriage is going to happen in Israel, and it gives instructions on what to do when a woman remarries. She's not forbidden from remarrying. And the husband who divorced her is not prohibited from taking a new wife, nor is there any prohibition on men marrying divorced women. These things were not out of bounds under Moses. It wasn't adultery under Moses. People were not stoned for remarrying at that time. Moses allowed this because of the hardness of their hearts. He allowed divorce, and it was understood that remarriage was to follow. We could speculate about why God gave them the prohibition on returning to the first husband under Moses. Maybe it was to discourage divorce in the first place, because that first husband would know, okay, if I do this, then there's no reversing this. I will lose her forever. So I'd better think about this carefully. And maybe that stopped a lot of divorces that would have happened otherwise. God was dealing with hard hearts, people who were not spiritually mature. And so he had many regulations at that time that served the purpose of keeping them in check in a certain way until the arrival of the Messiah, who would give more revelation and raise the expectations. Maybe you have some better ideas about why God gave some of these regulations at that time, but the point is, Jesus later comes and takes away the allowance to remarry in his law. You can't remarry in the first place now. And so the prohibition on returning to the first spouse after you remarry is moot. Remarriage is the abomination in the new covenant, because the first marriage is on for life now. So if someone returns to their first spouse under Jesus, they are simply leaving an adulterous affair and returning to the only person God has ever joined them to. And number two, the law of Moses comes as a whole. You cannot say that Deuteronomy 24's allowance for divorce and remarriage is taken away, but that its prohibition on returning to the first spouse still applies. You can't take one part of the passage and leave the other like that. If you are under some of it, you are under all of it. If some of the marriage regulations of Deuteronomy 24 still apply, then all of them apply. And if the marriage regulations of Deuteronomy 24 still apply, then so do the marriage regulations of Deuteronomy 25. Have you read those instructions on marriage in chapter 25 recently? Verses 5 and 6 of Deuteronomy 25 say that if a man dies leaving a widow and no children, his brother must marry her and raise a child to carry on the name of his dead brother. What's even more interesting is what is to be done if the brother does not want to marry his deceased brother's widow. Verses 8 to 10 say, if he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. So if you are one who says we cannot return to our first spouse after remarriage because of Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, would you hold a ceremony like this in your church if a man did not want to marry his brother's widow? Would you instruct a woman to take off one of her brother-in-law's shoes and spit in his face in front of the elders? And will his family forever be known as the family of the unsandaled in your church? Are these kinds of things acceptable or appropriate under the new covenant? No, it doesn't. It's not like that anymore. The Mosaic law, with all of its many regulations, is over. When circumcision was taken away, the whole Mosaic law went with it, including the marriage regulations of Deuteronomy 24 and 25. And now we have the law of Christ, the teaching of Jesus and the apostles. And it contains everything we need to know about how to live as disciples in the new covenant. And we are not supposed to take the law of Moses and the law of Christ and mix them together and come out with something in the middle. You know, take a little Deuteronomy 24, mix it together with a little Mark 10, take a little war, and mix it together with a little non-resistance and love for enemies. No, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, he is not under the law of Moses, but he is under the law of Christ. He's not under both of them, trying to kind of balance them out. I heard a wonderful insight sometime last year about the Mount of Transfiguration. When Jesus was up there with Peter, James, and John, Moses and Elijah appeared and were talking with him. And then Peter says, Master, let's make a tent for each of the three of you. And then God shows up in a cloud and says, This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. And when Peter, James, and John open their eyes, Moses and Elijah are gone. So what's going on there? What was the significance of Moses and Elijah appearing and talking with Jesus and then disappearing as God says to listen to Jesus? Well, you might say that Moses represents the law and that Elijah represents the prophets. And they both disappear as God says to the disciples, not simply, This is my son, listen to him, but this is my son, listen to him. Listen to him now. The law and the prophets were until John, said Jesus. You realize what that means? It means Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 was until John. But that's over. And Jesus is our teacher now. Listen to him. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Jesus is our great high priest in this covenant, as Hebrews says, and as Hebrews 7:12 says, with our new high priest, there has been a change in the law. Deuteronomy 24 is no longer in effect. Let it go. So Jesus says that remarriage is adultery in the new covenant. It wasn't that way under Moses, but now it is that way. And Paul says that a woman is bound to her husband until death. Not until he gives her a divorce certificate and sends her away, as was the case under Moses, but until death. So how do we fix remarriage in light of those new covenant realities? Well, as I said, we don't have any explicit instructions from Jesus or Paul on this. The law of Christ does not micromanage us in the way that the law of Moses did with the Israelites. Sometimes Jesus is silent on things, and we might wish he'd said a little bit more, and we are forced to think through it carefully, guided by the principles he has given us, and hopefully guided by the Holy Spirit, most importantly. I've already gone over what Jesus taught about marriage in earlier episodes, so I'm not going to go into that here, but I want to just present some implications of what he said and some logical arguments. And so this is a heavy question, and I've been afraid at times of addressing it because I feel the weight of it. So why don't we begin with an easier, less scary question than what is the solution for remarriage? Let's start with this instead. What is the solution for adultery? In the Old Covenant, it was stoning the adulterers. What about in the New Covenant? Because if we have the solution for adultery in the New Covenant, then we should have the solution for remarriage in the New Covenant, if we really agree with Jesus that remarriage is adultery. So, how should Christians correct adultery? What is the ideal solution under Jesus if someone's having an affair behind their spouse's back, for example? Is the solution that all three people involved, now need to be single and celibate? Or take a case where you've got two married couples, John and Stacy, and Mike and Jenny. If John and Jenny have an affair behind Stacy and Mike's backs, do all four of them now need to be single and celibate for the rest of their lives? Is that how we fix that situation? Of course not. The solution is repentance and forgiveness and reconciliation. The cheating spouse should cease from their adulterous behavior, repent, and seek forgiveness and reconciliation with their husband or wife. And their husband or wife, as hard as it may be, should forgive them and work it out with them. So if reconciliation is the ideal solution for adultery, then why wouldn't reconciliation be the ideal solution for remarriage? If Jesus puts remarriage into the adultery category, why would we treat remarriage as though it is something other than adultery? Why should we treat it as though it's in its own unique category by giving it a unique solution that Jesus did not prescribe? And think about this. Jesus knows that his disciples know that forgiveness and reconciliation is the ideal solution for other forms of adultery. And knowing that we know that, he puts remarriage into the category of adultery without giving any explicit instructions on how to deal with it. And that has left me frustrated at times, I must admit. But how do we best make sense of Jesus' silence on this incredibly important question of how to correct a remarriage situation? Well, I think the position that I'm advocating for and making a case for here makes far more sense of his silence than the other position. We're considering two possible scenarios here. Number one, that Jesus expects us to correct remarriage in the same way we would correct any other form of adultery. Or number two, that Jesus expects us to correct remarriage in a radically different way from how we would correct any other form of adultery. I think his silence makes much more sense in the first scenario. If Jesus wants us to correct remarriage in the same way we would correct any other form of adultery, by reconciling, if possible, then I can understand why he didn't give us explicit directions on how to fix remarriage. It's because we've already got the answer. All he has to do is move remarriage into the category of adultery, automatically assigning to it the same solution we would normally apply in cases of adultery. He doesn't need to say anything. It's reasonable for him to assume that we will resolve every kind of adultery in the same way, and it's reasonable for us to assume that we should apply the same solution across the board if Jesus gives no explicit instructions saying otherwise. But if Jesus wants us to treat remarriage radically differently from how we would typically treat adultery, and if resolving remarriage in the way we would typically resolve adultery will cost us our eternal life, then I do not understand why Jesus would label remarriage adultery without giving us very clear instructions on it and explaining to us in no uncertain terms that you must not resolve this particular kind of adultery in the same way you would resolve other kinds. So his silence is much harder to make sense of if this is the case, in my opinion. To say it again a little differently, if Jesus wants all forms of adultery to be dealt with in the same way, then his silence makes sense. But if he wants one particular kind of adultery, remarriage, to be dealt with in a unique way, and if failing to do so costs us our souls, then his silence on how to deal with remarriage is difficult to make sense of. Proponents of the position that we should remain single and celibate after remarriage may sometimes claim that it is the safer position. Best to stay single, just in case going back to your first spouse is not the right thing to do. But is that really the safer view? If Jesus has moved remarriage into the category of adultery, is it safest to treat it as though it is a unique issue in a category of its own, or is it safest to treat it like it's adultery? And you also have to consider the consequences of not going back to your first spouse if that turns out to be the right view. That's pretty serious as well. Now let's talk about the implications of something else Jesus says. He also tells us that when two people get married, they become one flesh, and that God joins them together. And he says, what God has joined together, let no one separate. The question is of what to do if someone then makes the terrible error of separating something Jesus commanded us not to separate. Well, I don't think this should be a tough one. If God tells us, hey, I put these two things together, make sure nobody separates them. If someone then separates them, isn't the most intuitive solution to put them back together as soon as possible? And does it really matter what's happened while those two things were separated? Put back together what God joined and said not to separate. But the other view, which says that if you remarry while separated, you must then remain single, seems to turn this teaching of Jesus on its head. It says what God has brought together, you must keep separated. And how do we get there? How do we get from what God has joined together, let no one separate, to you must keep separate what God has joined together? Does that seem like a safe position to take? I'd personally rather be the guy saying, put back together what God said not to separate. I think that's a more reasonable thing to assume we should do than to keep separate what God said not to separate. More on that particular issue, I think, in the next episode. Let's talk about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7. He summarizes the teaching of the Lord in verses 10 and 11. He says that a woman should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain single or else reconcile with her husband. Those are the two options he gives us if a woman feels the need to separate from her husband for some reason, I assume some really serious reason. And he gives no instructions on what the options are if remarriage has occurred during the period of separation. Now, what is the implication there for what to do if someone not only separates, but remarries? Would a remarriage eliminate the second option Paul gives, to reconcile? Well, that restriction is not in the text, obviously. So we would be creating a restriction Jesus and Paul did not give us to tell someone that if they remarry during the separation, that second option of reconciliation is no longer available. Why not just present to people the two options the text actually gives us, whether they have remarried or not, and not put words in Paul's mouth about what they can or cannot do if they have remarried? So we can say, okay, you left your husband. Paul says you need to remain unmarried or else reconcile. All right, you got remarried. Well, you're not allowed to do that. Get out of that remarriage. Now here are those two options Paul gave you: remain alone or else reconcile. What's it going to be? Because that way I'm just saying what the text does say, and I'm not injecting something into it that it does not say. And I think it's a safer route to give people the options the text actually presents, rather than eliminating one and giving them a rule that the text does not present. And here's something else to consider. Paul does not give us a disclaimer or an exception in this teaching here. He doesn't say she must remain alone or else reconcile unless she has married another. He simply offers the two options without any exceptions. So here's the question. Would Paul have been more likely to give both of these options without some kind of disclaimer or exception if he believed we could reconcile after remarriage, or if he believed we could not? Well, I think this would have been a bit of a sloppy thing for Paul to say if he thought that women who left a marriage and then remarried were then prohibited from reconciling with their first husbands. I would expect some kind of disclaimer in that case. Yes, Paul says that they must remain unmarried or else reconcile. So he's clear that you're not allowed to remarry. But he must have anticipated that there would be women who remarried before they knew about the teaching on divorce and remarriage. He must have known that there might be women who would not only separate but remarry because they were disobedient for a season or something. So I'd expect Paul to clarify any situations in which she could not reconcile so as not to lead anyone to the wrong conclusion. But if he thought that they could reconcile with their rightful husbands regardless of what may have occurred while they were separated, then I can understand why Paul felt comfortable giving both of these options without any disclaimers. So if you're someone who believes that we must remain single and celibate after remarriage and that we cannot return to our first spouse, would you ever say these words to a group of people? Would you write a letter or would you give a talk on marriage to a good-sized group of people and just tell people if you separate from your spouse, you must either remain alone or else reconcile? Would you feel comfortable giving both of those options and then moving on and saying nothing more about it, not giving any exceptions? Or would you feel the need to clarify that you can only reconcile as long as you have remained unmarried during the separation? I think it's a bit like the awkward situation that many Protestant evangelicals are in who believe there's an exception for remarriage. They can't teach on divorce and remarriage like Jesus did in Mark 10 and Luke 16. They can't get up in front of a crowd of people and say, whoever divorces their spouse and marries another commits adultery, or whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. They can't just say that and then never mention the exception that they believe Jesus allows for remarriage. They would be irresponsible to do so if there's an exception. They always have to mention the exception so as not to lead people to what they think are the wrong conclusions. And in a similar way, if you believe that reconciliation with the first spouse is not allowed after remarriage, then you can't get up in front of a big group of people and say, if you separate from your husband, remain unmarried or else reconcile, and then just move on. You have to clarify, if you separate from your husband, remain unmarried or else reconcile, but if you have remarried during your separation, then you cannot reconcile. You have to say that. I think you'd be irresponsible not to clarify that anytime you teach people about this, if that's what you believe, so that you don't give people, what you think would be the wrong impression and put their souls in jeopardy. But why didn't Paul seem to feel the need to clarify that? I think it's most likely because he didn't think any disclaimers were needed. He didn't think there was anything a woman could do during the period of separation that would eliminate that second option to reconcile with her husband. So I think it's real simple. We should treat remarriage like it's adultery, not like it's something else. I heard a good sermon on marriage some years ago. The preacher reminded his listeners that the husband is the head of his wife. And he made a good point. A husband is the head of his wife as Christ is the head of the church. And you can't cut the head off of a body and put on a new head. In other words, you can't sever a woman from her husband, not in God's eyes, and give her a new husband. You can't do that, not anymore, maybe under Moses. But now under Jesus, she's stuck with the first guy as long as he's alive, and he's stuck with her. She can physically separate and commit adultery with somebody else, and yeah, sure, you can call it a marriage, but she's going to be living in adultery because that first guy's still alive. And so just as our heads are stuck with our bodies, a husband and a wife are stuck with each other till one of them dies. And you certainly can't attach 2 or 3 or 4 heads to one body. But that's what this other view would have us believe, that a woman can be walking around out there with 3 or 4 heads, 3 or 4 husbands, one for every marriage she's entered into. She's bound to all of them, and they're all bound to her and anyone else that they may have married. But all of them have to live as though they're single and bound to no one. Does that really make sense? I think what makes more sense to me is that there's one man and one woman, one head, one body for life. And that's why remarriages need to end, because the connection between a husband and a wife, joined by God, is severed only by death. Remarriage is adultery. It's an affair. So let's act like we actually believe that and treat it like what it is. So in the next episode, I'll respond to some of the best arguments I'm aware of against what I've said here. And thanks for your patience in listening to what I've had to say. And I know this is a difficult subject. And if you'd like to talk, please let me know. God bless you.